Well, of course, D&D got popular nationwide back in the mid-70s. It hit where I was living in the Philadelphia area in 75, 76, fairly early on. And I got turned onto it by a friend of mine, brought in this cool new game. This was the little box, brown at the time. And so we started messing around with it, couldn't figure much out. It kind of rested for a year until the Holmes came out, a year or two later, and that helped a lot in translating it. But Judges Guild was cranking stuff out too, then even that early. So we started putting it all together. We were playing one-on-one, one-on-two sort of things, and then the word started spreading. In the course of the next 5 years, I became fairly well known as one of the top dungeon Mentzers, haha, which they use later, in the greater Philadelphia area. I'd go to game shops now and then and pick up even more new players till I was running games for 15, 20 people at a time occasionally. Generally, though, only around a dozen, a modest normal crew. But in late '79, I was unemployed, living on unemployment compensation, and a friend of mine showed me a Dragon magazine, which I couldn't afford at the time, and said, look, they're advertising for designers and editors, one of each. And I said, yeah, right, okay, only about 20,000 people are going to apply for those two jobs. And he and some other people worked on me for a while and badgered me into applying, so I did, not thinking much would come of it. The folks at TSR gave me a call by December and asked me to come out for an interview, but I couldn't afford that. I was, penniless. So they agreed grudgingly to interview me by phone, which they did, interrupting me over dinner. I figured that went lousy too, because they kept dropping things, pots and pans and all that. But they called back and decided I was there kind of strange, and they hired me as an editor, although I had very little editing experience, because they had picked this other guy by the name of Tom Moldvay for the designer spot. Well, right away they threw heavy stuff at Tom. He wrote the D&D, first D&D sets of that era, the basic and expert sets, and various great modules and things, while I was put to work editing stuff. And then, since I had come to Gary's attention with a thing or two and won the national DM competition that year that was awarded at Gen Con, all of a sudden everybody said, Frank who? Who is this guy? And long and the short of it, they asked me to start this game club for D&D players, which was the RPGA. And I developed and started that and ran it for a year and a half. And then turned it over to somebody else. We're up to about 1982, because Gary said, well, we got the big project. We need a new version of D&D for a variety of business reasons and gamer reasons, stuff that never been addressed. So that occupied most of the rest of my time at TSR until I left in '86 to join Gary at a new game company. Well, like everybody else's, my gosh, this is the guy who started everything. Coming out of World War II, nobody wanted to talk about the war who was involved in it, but a lot of us were interested in what happened. So you had the first published war games from Avalon Hill in the 50s and then into the 60s. There had been an undercurrent of war gamers playing with miniature figures, toy soldier crowd. And what little support they had was very few sets of published rules, although there were some standards. How far you move the little miniature figures and how you indicate damage and things like that. How you turn this into a game instead of just a toy. But in the mid to late 60s, it became, the cultural climate post-war was markedly different from pre-war, because all of a sudden the concept of the family game arose. In the 30s, you didn't have a family game per se, although Monopoly was popular and Easy Money and some other famous board games. It was struggle and make do in the Depression, and then wartime, well, that's wartime. You're making all these sacrifices. You don't think in terms of leisure and entertainment and that sort of thing. So the baby boomer crowd, the post-war guys coming back from the war, are buying into Milton Bradley Parker Brothers concepts of the family game, sit around with mom, dad, and the kids. And that make this a type of pastime as much as a class of pastime as go to the movies or, or the church picnic, you name it. And they succeeded in making it so. But whenever you have a mainstream current like that, you also have an undercurrent of specialists. In this case, those old miniature wargamers were still playing, not with the family, certainly, playing their own versions, and they were getting very little support, so they made up their own rules for a lot of things. If you wanted to play ancient Medes and Persians in an ancient setting with the limited weapons and primitive tactics, you collected the figures for it, you found a set of rules to govern that as a game, and so maybe you started a club with other people who were into ancients. Another club may have started up for Civil War, American Civil War things, or more obscure to Americans, English Civil War, War of the Roses, any of the various permutations. Napoleonics was very big, and all these, once again, you have little miniature figures, sets of rules to govern it, and so forth. Gary Gygax was instrumental in starting a network of clubs called the International Federation of Wargamers, somewhat glorified title since it was almost exclusively American, but nevertheless, all these clubs that, once again, have all their individual little specialties, ancients, Napoleonics, the American Civil War, ECW, English Civil War, or in Gary's case, medieval, Arthurian, the knights and the round table and the legendary beasts described by myth and legend of the time. So he's a seminal figure from that respect, having started wargaming clubs in this International Federation of Wargamers who participated in its creation, and head of the local Lake Geneva club who specialized in medieval miniatures. And what happened there, and the reason we have the growth of fantasy and science fiction, role-playing games, movies, computer games, everything, all traces back to this one point in roughly 68 to 72, when in Gary's Game Club, the rules that they developed themselves, because they didn't like published stuff, developed themselves for these medieval games, included not just King Arthur, but Merlin. And what magic could Merlin add to the situation? Likewise, the evil witch on the bad guy's side, etc. And somebody at some fateful point doubtless said, well, in Lord of the Rings or in The Hobbit, they have these, hobbits and elves and dwarves and their classic figures. Let's stick something in about them. So the chainmail rules that Gary wrote with his co-author, published by and for the club initially, and then by a micro company down in southern Indiana in Evansville called Guide Games. By the time that was ready for its third printing, Gary and company had learned enough about publishing by watching what the Evansville guys were doing. They said, well, let's try it ourselves. So they floated this little company, Tactical Studies and Rules. Mark that name. They were publishing mostly war game rules. I could run through a bunch of titles, but they're so obscure nowadays, only the hardcore collectors are interested. But as a result of this creation, then combining the fantasy medieval with orthodox historical medieval, that started catching on, and of course then Dave Arneson with his fateful contribution of, well, what instead of armies or whole groups of a dozen knights, what if you get down to just the individuals who find this dragon in some ruins or do this and that? And so this synergy, this hybrid of Dave's single character approach or small group approach versus Gary's mass battles, realms in conflict, England versus France, that was Gary's thing. But Gary was the one who spent the time, decided to spend the time of his life, prime time in his 30s there and 40s, writing up these rules and making a go of making a company to publish them and to make this happen. Hence was born the Dungeons and Dragons game, which in combination with the resurgence and popularity of Tolkien's works in the legendary college age of the late 60s and early 70s, and that synergy, the word spreading about this new type of game, thanks to the support provided by Bob Bledsoe and Judges Guild of Decatur, Illinois, just a bit to the south of here. Again, these Midwesterners, Upper Midwest with Dave and the Twin Cities, Minnesota crew, the general Southern Wisconsin crew with Gary and his friends, and then the Illinois Central and Northern, kept synergizing, staying in touch with each other, developing, the word kept spreading, and then suddenly some spark ignited and it kicked in and became a national craze.